Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Chris Jansen, and I head up local news partnerships at Google. Hopefully, some of you are familiar with the Google News Initiative, which is our effort to work with the news industry to help journalism thrive in the digital age. We invest in projects, we invest in people, and investments in things that we feel can lead the news industry into a more sustainable future. So today we're going to talk about one of those efforts, and we're going to meet three of those people. By way of background to start, a couple months back in early May, the National Trust for Local News announced it was acquiring Colorado Community Media via the Colorado News Conservancy, which is a new public benefit corporation. So through a pretty innovative deal with FJC, a deal structure, these organizations are unlocking a new path forward for acquiring and financing transformation for 24 community newspapers in the Denver metro area, and along the way, bringing in both local and national funders in the process. So this is a really innovative and collaborative investment approach, and it offers a new path for transformation and sustainability. It's an understatement to say that we all know that high quality local news is extremely important, that it is critical to society. We need to be creative about new ways to fund and support this journalism. So in the session, we're going to analyze the potential role for impact investment in community media, as well as new opportunities for philanthropic impact beyond just traditional grant making. So what we're about to discuss represents a new way to think about financially supporting local news, which we're pretty excited about. So with that, let's begin to introduce our three guest speakers today. I'd first like to invite Elizabeth to say hello and tell us about herself. And as I've asked Elizabeth to do, maybe share one thing in that introduction about how local news has been meaningful in your life. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks PMDMC for having us here for this discussion this afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Hansen Shapiro. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the National Trust for Local News. And one way that local news has impacted my life, my grandmother was a local news reporter in Saginaw, Michigan, and so I grew up hearing her tell stories and hearing my dad tell stories about how important the news was to their family. My grandmother was a high school dropout who raised 9 children. And the writing that she did for the paper was the way that she shared about her life and connected to the people in her community. And to me, that just illustrates, I think, one of the amazing parts about local news is that community connection. So that's how it's important.
Thank you, Elizabeth. The community connection, absolutely. So Lillian, please say hello.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lillian Ruiz, and I am Managing Director and of Portfolio at the National Trust for Local News. Coming to this with a background in revenue sustainability, operational strategy, and business model planning and innovation. And should I answer the local news question as well?
Absolutely.
So my local news story, actually kind of similar to Elizabeth. My stepdad was a local historian and columnist for the Times Herald Record up in upstate New York. So I spent many a lengthy childhood afternoon being sent to fetch people's microfiche and help them with their research at the tender age of 7 or 8. And I just loved everything about it. I loved the energy, and I, as a busybody myself, I certainly loved being at the center of information, of local information. So.
Microfiche, I love that. I think that resonates for a lot of us. Those of you listening, throw in the chat window if microfiche was a near and dear part of your work history as well. And then thanks, Lillian, and one more guest to welcome, Sam. Please say hello, and love to hear your little tidbit about local news.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Sam Marks. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of FJC, a foundation of philanthropic funds. We are a public foundation, primarily a sponsor of donor-advised funds, but we're also a nonprofit lender, which is how we kind of plug into this story. My background has been in the nonprofit sector, community economic development, impact investing, sort of approaching stuff with a business lens, but with the mission outcome. It's my sweet spot. In terms of local news, I'm a native New Yorker, so the New York Times is kind of my hometown newspaper. Also, very formative. I was an avid Village Voice reader in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s. And I guess I am also an avid consumer of nonprofit news, particularly Gotham Gazette, which has been instrumental to my professional kind of getting my arms around what's going on in the city, and newcomers like the City and Chalkbeat. So.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Sam. Welcome to all three of you. Loved hearing those stories. I'm loving looking at this chat window and seeing lots of hellos from around the country. So welcome, welcome to you all. Our goal is to make the next hour-ish meaningful and valuable to you. Maybe I'm inspired by what the three of you were talking about in terms of the impact of local news. I'll share one quick story for me. I still remember the feeling of working in local radio, being the news director for 3 radio stations that were all in the same little building, and the day that the first story that I had written that was picked up by the Associated Press, and getting a residual check for like $32, months later. So I still remember the feeling about that. Maybe some of you can relate, and some of the folks who are listening in can relate today. So with that, why don't we dive in here? So Elizabeth, I'd love to start with you here. Let's, by way of table setting, I guess. Can you tell us what is the National Trust for Local News?
Yeah, sure. So we are a national nonprofit, and our mission is to keep local news in local hands. So we're doing that by working with communities and publishers and funders to preserve community newspapers, to set up new ownership structures, and to create new paths to sustainability.
And expand on that, if you would, a bit. How did this all start? Where did this idea come from?
Yeah, so like all good ideas, this one came from a lot of places. Our co-founder, Mark Hand, who will be familiar to some of you out there, he and I began talking about the idea of a nature conservancy for local newspapers a little more than a year ago. And he, had experience building funds to preserve public broadcasting licenses. And that was work that he did through founding Public Media Company. And that's work that Public Media Company still does. And he had this idea that a similar fund and structure might work for preserving newspapers. And I had been studying sustainability efforts at the Shorenstein Center, looking at, how folks were building new business models in different parts of the industry. And I had been studying, as some of you all out there know, the acquisitions and mergers of public broadcasters and digital news outlets. And it became pretty clear to me that that was a very compelling model, but that, a pooled investment fund and a national entity could really help encourage, with funding and technical assistance, those kinds of models, not just in public broadcasting, but really in newspapers, where we haven't seen a lot of that kind of creative preservation and kind of, new models before. So that was kind of on our side. And then at the same time, our co-founder and colleague, Steve Waldman, was thinking a lot about replanting big metro newspapers into nonprofits. And of course, our other co-founder, Fraser Nelson, was hard at work at the Salt Lake Tribune doing exactly that. And then, Lillian, and she can talk more about this as well, was working with small media outlets around the country and really starting to see this need for operational and business discipline, and the need for like a national entity that could really help lean in on that front. So her piece of that was really the final piece of the puzzle for us, bringing all of these people and ideas together. And that's the origin story of the National Trust.
Thanks for that, Elizabeth. I'm always fascinated about how it's easy to have ideas, right? It's easy to think big, but then actually translating that into action. And so it's so fascinating to watch that arc. And so Lillian, let's bring you in here. I'd love for you to talk about the first acquisition, Colorado Community Media, but please, definitely share your recollections from the early days and how this all began and your involvement with it.
Yeah, I mean, the early days, they feel at this point like they were years ago, but I guess it was really just a few months ago. But, one of the things that was really exciting about kind of coming to the trust was feeling like, two halves of that same coin, having a really compelling idea for a fund structure and investment structure, and also, the portfolio based and sort of not necessarily shared service, but high level, national, strategic, market quality advisory and services that, I was looking to kind of develop and bring that to the trust. It just felt like, a very peanut butter and jelly sort of situation that was kind of primed for happening. And then, by the time I got to the trust in January, the process with the transaction was really already kind of underway since about, November. So it really started with Elizabeth and Fraser and Mark and Steve. So when I got on board, we were evaluating and advising an individual owner publisher. So at first we were supporting this, potential entrepreneur who was looking to take the leap. And that ultimately fell through. The scale of the organization we're looking at, which is 24 papers, just felt too daunting for a first-time publisher. And as Elizabeth was saying, we see our mission as a mission of preservation, like the Nature Conservancy, and wanting to smooth out transitions and ownership to the community. So based on that, we decided to just forge ahead with the acquisition with ourselves in that ownership and operating position, and continue to look for local operating and local publishing partners. So, we structured this as a fully leveraged deal, the trust being pre-fundraise and our eventual operating partners themselves being in growth mode. We worked with FJC to, structure this as a leveraged deal. So FJC is our nonprofit lender, and Sam will obviously talk more about that. But, the loan was guaranteed by a group of local and national foundations. It was a really exciting and interesting way to see, all their balance sheets come into play, all sorts of things that make this new and interesting. The trust created the Colorado News Conservancy as a public benefit corporation. Lended our loan. And then post-close, we brought on the Colorado Sun with a starting equity stake that'll increase over time. And that relationship was really exciting based on my prior work with them through Civil Media, which was an earlier, business model and revenue model project. So,
thanks, Lillian. As you reflect on that experience, can you call out one key learning that you're applying to future acquisitions?
One is tough, but I think if there was something to take away, one of the things why this worked so well in Colorado is how networked and collaborative that space is. So something that we're looking to take away is how do we find that in other places, other communities, and bring that forward and bring that to the fore and make the collaborative nature and the network nature of how media organizations, local media organizations, are increasingly trying to work. How do we bring that, pull that forward to create the infrastructure needed to pull off these sorts of big swing new investment structures?
Thanks, Lillian. I'll highlight the word collaboration, something that certainly we talk about all the time in our work at Google, and I'm sure everybody listening, and that's a key theme in business, isn't it? Let's bring Sam in here in just a second, but I do want to remind our audience that if you have any questions you'd like to pose, we welcome you to put those into the chat window. We have some folks monitoring that for us, and we will do our best to address questions throughout the session. So keep it coming. So Sam, jump in here, please. You talked a little bit about it in the beginning, but maybe you could expand more on what FJC actually is, what your role with it is, and then I'm going to ask you to define a couple of basic terms that we've already started to throw out in this conversation.
Great. So as I mentioned, FJC was the acquisition lender on this transaction, but we're not a typical lender. We are a nonprofit organization. We are a public foundation, so we hold philanthropic assets on behalf of account holders. We have $360 million in assets and about 1,100 accounts. They're mostly donor-advised funds, but we have other types of philanthropic accounts as well. I'm just providing this context to give a sense of kind of how we're coming to this work and what our source of capital is. But think about us as having like hundreds of little mini foundations under our umbrella. And what we provide to our account holders is a scaled platform. Our account holders, some of them have a few $1,000s in their accounts, some have many millions in their accounts, and we take care of the operational tax reporting, audit, all of that stuff so that our donors can do the fun stuff of recommending grants and deploying their philanthropic capital as grants. Most of our account holders are individuals. We have some institutions and corporates, basically anyone who wants to have the functionality of a foundation, but with the ability to offload a lot of the headaches to somebody else, and we're that somebody else. So we also make loans to nonprofits. And the key point here is that the source of capital that we use to make these loans is the philanthropic dollars from our donors that are invested with us. So think about, a typical foundation. They have their grant making spend, but they also have their endowment that's invested for growth so that the foundation can make their grants without spending down their endowments. So it's sort of like that. Our donors have a menu of choices regarding how they invest their funds for growth. And some are pretty plain vanilla, like stocks or bonds and mutual funds, the kinds of things you'd find in a 401k plan. But one option they have is our agency loan fund. And there we pool those dollars together and we invest them in loans to nonprofits. So the interest and principal payments that come back from our borrowers come back to grow the accounts. So our acquisition loan to the National Trust for local news came from this pool. And I should mention that Elizabeth mentioned Public Media Group. They're a longtime partner and borrower of ours. So we had some familiarity with sort of the precursor model where mission stewardship can really build the capacity for an industry. So I'll just say we're not like a bank in a lot of ways, but we do have a fiduciary responsibility to our donors. The funds that we steward on behalf of our donors enhance their ability to sort of have philanthropic activity. So like banks, we take our credit decisions very seriously and we vet transactions carefully. But with our lending, the goal is to support nonprofit organizations to meet their financing needs and their missions. And we do generate a return on this activity, but it's pretty modest. So all of our loans go out at a floating rate of prime plus 3%, which was about 6.25% for this loan. So we want to be compensated for the risk, but our goal is not about making money. Our goal is in supporting the nonprofit sector. And then finally, when we climb into a deal, very often we'll help think through structures and figure out how we can get to yes if a deal doesn't seem like it fits us in the first moments.
Thanks, Sam. I'm curious, how do donors find you?
A lot of different ways. There are many different platforms for donor advised funds, but I think a lot of donors come to us because at 360 million, we're actually kind of small or medium sized compared to some of the big institutional DAF providers that are affiliated with financial service companies. So folks come to us because we're small and we're sort of boutique-y and we like to do interesting stuff with the money, put money into impact investments. We can be really responsive to donors that want to do things that are a little bit outside of the box.
And forgive me, I was having trouble coming off mute. Story of 2020, 2021, right? Quote of 2020, you're on mute. In what you're saying, I wonder if we can just pause a moment and do some definitions of some of the terms that we're using here. I don't know if anybody out there is like me, but all things finance and investment don't necessarily come naturally to me. And so let's do some basics here. When you say donor advised fund, what exactly is that?
That is an account that you set up at a sponsor like us, where let's say you want to start your own foundation, but you don't want the headaches of starting your own foundation. You open an account. You can open an account with as little as $5,000. You make a donation to FJC, so that money goes into your account. You get a tax deduction as soon as you make that donation to FJC because we're a 501c3 nonprofit. So the money comes to us. It becomes legally our asset. But as the donor, as the account holder, you have recommendation privileges where you can recommend how that $5,000 or more is turned into grants or philanthropic loans or impact investments. Legally, we can do with it what we want, but for all practical purposes, we will follow your recommendations like 99.99% of the time. We've signed on to a Hate is Not Charitable campaign. So any donations to 501c3 nonprofits that are listed as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center, that we will reject. But for the most part, we follow. That's why it's called a donor advised fund. You advise us, you make recommendations, but for all intents and purposes, we follow the recommendations of our donors.
Got it. And we've thrown out the term impact investing several times. What is that?
That is a term that has many different definitions. I mean, anytime you're making an investment, if it's in an oil company or if it's in a charter school network, you're having some kind of impact. But generally, people are talking about impact investing in terms of looking not just at financial return, but being intentional about the impact you want to have on the world. This can range from a market strategy where you're investing in public companies and stocks and bonds, but maybe you're excluding some bad actors, or you're putting a kind of an environmental theme on it. That's called ESG investing, for environment, sustainability, and governance. But it can also go to sort of impact first investing, where maybe you're willing to forego some of your return or even put some of your principal at risk because you believe in the impact that you're doing. So it's a wide range of asset classes, of risk return profiles. But I think what binds it together is that the people who are investing their dollars are doing it with some intentionality about the impact they want to have.
Intentionality about impact. Got it. Thanks for that definition. And Lillian, let me pull you back in here for a second, because when you were speaking before, you used the term leveraged deal. Can you just define for the audience, what do we mean by a leveraged deal?
Yeah, a leveraged deal is just an acquisition done through debt. So for the trust, we took out that loan, and we acquired it based on our against our debt. So it's pretty straightforward, thankfully.
Got it. Thanks, Lillian. And Sam, let's continue talking about FJC's role here in the Colorado News Conservancy. Any challenges you want to call out in terms of making that loan? How were you able to structure around those challenges?
Right. So, when the National Trust came to FJC, they were looking for a $1.5 million loan to acquire this consortium of newspapers. And we really wanted to do this loan. The mission side of us was all in. We had to balance that with our fiduciary responsibility to our donors, and to make sure that this was a good loan to make from that perspective. So there were a couple of challenges. One was the National Trust for Local News was our borrower, and they were a pretty new entity. That year and a half you've been operating may seem like decades to you guys, but in terms of a track record as a borrower for a lender, it could give us pause. Also, the National Trust doesn't have a robust balance sheet, so it hasn't been around very long, and it doesn't have a lot of assets for us to look to for collateral. So that was one challenge. The other challenge is when our loans are typically they're not like 30-year fixed rate mortgages, right? They're 3 to 5 year loans. They're relatively short-term loans. And in most cases, when we're making a loan to a nonprofit, we have a very clear sense of the takeout. How are we going to be repaid? Very often, it's a city or state contract, a contract that's slow to pay. We know the money's coming, but we have to bridge the timing issue there, or a public sector capital commitment, for instance. Here, there wasn't a clear takeout financing for the trust for what was going to happen in 5 years when the loan comes due. So those are pretty big hurdles. But FJC wanted to see this happen. We climbed into the trust to see how could we get to yes, how could we get there? The innovation really excited us. So one of the questions we always ask is there a guarantor in the mix? Is there some entity with some assets that's willing to stand behind this transaction. And the good news was, the philanthropic community. I mean, Lillian spoke to the network nature of all of these relationships. And there were a number of foundations that had already provided support either to the trust or other actors in this system. So they were the Colorado Trust, the Gates Family Foundation, and the American Journalism Project, all significant organizations with robust balance sheets. And so these three philanthropic actors were willing to stand behind the transaction and guarantee it. And that's what got FJC comfortable with making the loan. Together, they provided $1.5 million in guarantees against our $1.5 million loan. So the interesting thing here is that these are not funded commitments. This is not a $1.5 million that these foundations have to spend down. These are called contingent liabilities, which means they only become cash expenditures in the event that something goes sideways or the deal goes bad. So the trust wasn't going back to their committed funders for more grants or for sort of ongoing annual subsidies. They were going for this contingent liability and for the foundations to stand up. So this is hugely significant because private foundations typically spend down around 5% of their assets per year on grants, but the rest of their balance sheets, that's invested in their endowment, those could theoretically be put to work as guarantees for innovative structures like this, where it's something new, it's something impactful, but the actors don't have the balance sheets to stand it up.
Thanks, Sam. Our audience is heavily involved here. We're seeing lots of questions. Let's pause here and see if we can address some of these thematically. Thanks, Terry, Deb, a few others for questions. What I'm observing here is a general question of how do other organizations get involved? How do we tap into FJC's resources?
That's a great question. And this is one of the biggest challenges for me in my role as a CEO of a donor advised fund sponsor, which is that we're often very reactive to our donors' interests and what they want to provide grants or loans to. When we're talking about the types of loans and acquisition loans that we're providing to the National Trust, we at the staff level, we get inbound interest from prospective borrowers, and we vet the deals. So anyone who wants to get a loan from us, who has a deal they're putting together, reach out to me, and we can see if it's something that's a fit. I have less of an open door policy around folks that want grant support from us, simply because our donors are advising us about how they want funds at FJC to be spent, and that advice often doesn't go in the other direction. So happy to talk to anybody about loans or deal structure. Grant making is a little bit harder for us to be flexible about at the staff.
Very clear. Thanks, Sam. Very clear. Pulling back in that theme of the donor has some direction in terms of how those dollars are used. Some other questions coming up, and kind of something that we were going to address anyway, but maybe you can talk about why this is particularly suited to impact investors vis-a-vis private equity. Talk about the dynamic between those two models.
I think that's for me, right, Chris?
Yes, Sam, you can start there. And then, of course, Elizabeth and Lillian, welcome you to jump in at any point.
So think about the typical players in the market that are looking to acquire local newspapers. They're often private equity funds, and their North Star is maximizing returns. This is what they're seeking when they seek ownership. How can we maximize profit? And their capital providers are equity investors that are looking for double-digit returns. They understand that some of the companies are going to sort of crack under the pressure of the new management, and they may go out of business. They may become obsolete, and that's fine with them, because in a portfolio of private equity companies, there's some winners and there's some losers. And as long as a few big winners compensate for the losers, it's really just numbers on a spreadsheet to them. So a mission-based nonprofit like the National Trust, they have a different obligation as an owner. They want to create a sustainable business model they want it to be sustainable, but the profit is not the goal. The profit is in service to their North Star, which is, the public good, having a robust local news, taking the long view, keeping policymakers to account, all of that stuff of democracy. That's the reason why we want to have local news. So you need to have financing that aligns with the mission. When you've got FJC is the lender and all of our capital is kind of coming from the philanthropic sector, and then guarantees provided by philanthropy, you've got people with business fundamentals involved in the financing, but who agree with the mission. What I find really compelling about this model and hopefully replicable is that it's all mission-aligned funding. It's willing to be creative. It's willing to be patient. It's willing to share risk. As the world of impact investing evolves, and it's evolving all the time, the hope is that we'll see more mission-aligned capital coming in to help facilitate these.
Yeah, mission investing versus investing purely for return. Let's, Lillian, why don't we talk about, when I think of, along this theme of mission, I suppose, when I think of community news organization, one of the things that comes to mind for me is that first and foremost, they're small businesses. And it's not easy to be a small business. So how do you think about the trust's potential impact here?
Yeah, I mean, the plight of the small business, whether you are a news organization or the restaurant down the street, is always this need for access, need for resources, need for mentorship, and sometimes having a little bit of a bigger dog in the fight for you. So, like Sam was saying, patient mission-aligned capital is necessary for these organizations. When we're talking about community media, it's completely necessary for their evolution. We're talking about evolution being defined as helping them refine their local value proposition. So really having the skill set to get in there with them and work through, how do you identify this? What is your secret sauce? Where are you strongest? And how can we turn that into an opportunity? And then that turns into identifying their unique revenue access points that are specific to them as a community media organization. And then I think kind of the last place where the trust really sees ourselves as bringing some weight is helping to develop, revitalize digital properties that have attributable behaviors baked into how they're structured so that we can over time showcase the positive impact of journalism. These are things that if you are even if you're a big team of 40 at a community paper, nobody has the time to think about these things. Like, that's not coming to you naturally. So that's where we say, from our expertise, we can bring, and our partnerships and the relationships we have, we can help bring that and elevate sort of the operational soundness and the efficiencies in how you look at innovation, revenue experimentation, give them the headroom to actually get to these places. And that's something that, most small businesses don't have access to. So I think that's where we really see our opportunity in being impactful.
And Elizabeth, speaking of that impact, can you talk about some of the different ways that the trust is thinking about making investments in community media? There's I don't agree with this phrase, but some people have used words like dying business. Again, I don't agree with that, but why does it make sense to invest here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, we think about investment strategy vis-a-vis a straight philanthropic subsidy strategy. And I think there's been some questions in the chat about, venture philanthropy, is this the same or different? As we look across the local news landscape, we really see kind of two problems to be solved. One is a business model problem, as Lillian was talking about, diversifying revenue streams, making up for lost print advertising, changing consumer behavior. So that's one set of issues. And then the other set of issues are really ownership and governance problems. So you have the business model, how do you diversify revenue? And then you have this problem of like corporate consolidation, right? So a ridiculous number of papers in this country are owned by corporations. But you also have, a whole generation of small business owners of independent community media who are ready to retire and they don't have good off ramps. So those two problems, business model problems and ownership and governance problems, philanthropy is an important tool on the business model side as a source of subsidy to kind of shore up some of those revenue streams. But philanthropy is really, really not a great solution for the ownership and governance problems. Like in this case of the Salt Lake Tribune, there's a billionaire who can step up and say, I want to buy this paper, or, Jeff Bezos can buy the Washington Post. But in a lot of communities, there just aren't big philanthropists who want to own media, and there aren't foundations who want to own media either. So where an investment strategy becomes powerful is to solve for those ownership and governance problems. So that, and that's what we can do. We can say these business models for community media still have a lot of life in them. They're weekly papers, they're not metros. We can see a path to sustainability on the business model side. And that means that we can use investments as a tool at the ownership and governance level to really set up structures that align all the incentives, right? So you have the community partners at the table, you have public service as the North Star, and those are different ownership structures than either a small business owner who's struggling on their own or big consolidated corporation. So that's why we think this is a really important tool in the toolbox.
Elizabeth, I liked how you called out weeklies. I'm reflecting on our own experience last year of a special program we did, the Journalism Emergency Relief Fund, and the applications that came in. It really was staggering, the number of weekly publications, and it became ever more clear to me of their role, right, in community media. So you called out business model, ownership and governance. Lillian, maybe on the business model side, can you talk about does a partner's level of investment in print versus digital affect your approach?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends. Like when we're looking at partners, within our team ourselves, we are assembled to have a pretty unique skill set, Elizabeth, with business model innovation, public media, M&A and investment banking, my background in startups, Fraser nonprofit conversion, Mark in nonprofit financing. What we're really looking for when we're talking about, say, an operating partner or publishing partner is whoever's going to complement not just our skills, but complement the skills and the gaps that surface in our analysis, and being able to fill in those gaps for us and couple it with real on the ground capacity. So what we're learning post-transaction is, how to really account for what a staff brings to the table and what the internal partnerships and external partnerships bring to the table, alongside what we learned pre-transaction. And so, I think, and I hope that I'm answering the question, but I think in terms of whether whether a partner has a print first or a digital first model, that's really going to come down to just what we see in our analysis and what we see in the context of what's really needed. In Colorado, the Colorado Sun is a digital first model, but the entire staff has a newspaper crossover background, which is fantastic. And that's a great fit for where these papers were in their transition, but we might find a completely, different set of issues, somewhere else. And that'll really, really change how we set up the call and the need and the milestones for a potential operating and publishing partner there.
Thanks, Lillian. Let me stay with you on this one, and then Elizabeth, welcome you to chime in here as well. So thematically, in our work with local news publishers, we continue to hear the prioritization of certain revenue streams, such as ad revenue, such as subscription revenue. So you've both touched on it already. So maybe speak a little bit more. Like how do you think about going into a potential acquisition and balancing disruption with consistency of the work that's already going on?
Yeah, I mean, I will be the first to say that we are still finding and striking that balance, and some of it is learning by doing. But I think in an ideal scenario, we're coming to the table assuming that these organizations already kind of hit certain checkpoints for us. They already have that proven foothold in the local business community. They already have access to local civic and social institutions. They already have a successful track record of, say, community service or advocacy. So those things all kind of undergird what we decide needs to be done to not, tip over the apple cart. So, for example, in Colorado, we took a first do no harm sort of method, but ultimately, what really is making progress there is the amount of time that we were able to spend with the diligence in advance, but also the amount of time we were able to spend on the ground. We got out there and we were there for 10 days, really understanding, okay, we've got the theoretical knowledge, but now let's understand what this staff can actually do and where they're actually driven, so that we can make sure that the revenue strategies that we've created actually match what is there, temperamentally, what matches the squishy stuff, really. So I think to that effect, that makes us very, very different from a typical corporate owner, and it makes us very different from a typical investor, because that's not the kind of involvement and maybe meddling that you would often see. But I think we have a different priority in terms of how to push to diversified revenue and push to success and sustainability, partially because we're not coming from a nonprofit programmatic background, and partially because we're not coming entirely from a EBITDA driven, let's get the most out of this background either. So we get to sit in the sweet spot and really have a consultative, deep relationship approach.
So you've started to hone in on something that I was gonna that I'd hope surface, which is basically developing what your investment criteria are for community media. Elizabeth, do you want to jump in here, add some other thoughts in terms of needs for investment in the community media? What does why is investment support important to community media?
Yeah, so as Lillian was saying, we see so much potential in community media, because these are local publications that enjoy an incredible amount of local loyalty and civic pride, and so we really see that as the foundation that we can build upon to diversify revenue, to diversify products. I mean, a lot of these are family businesses, and so some of them are very they're very messy under the hood, shall we say. And so there's opportunities for investing in like infrastructure upgrades, certainly on the digital side, and just some basic level of professionalization. And so we're able to kind of bring all of that at a national level. And as we build out our portfolio, we're able to look across the set of organizations that we're working with and say, well, what are the common themes? What are the shared efficiencies that we can put in place? So, our role post-transaction as part owners and advisors is, I think, what makes this a pretty compelling impact investment opportunity, because we can pull a lot of those levers that it can be difficult when you're just in a philanthropic grant-making role to pull.
And speaking of being in that world, like you identified it kind of towards the beginning. You gave the example of the Nature Conservancy. Can you speak a bit more about how and where similar models have been tried in other spaces?
Yeah, so we did a lot of work in our very early startup phase, talking with folks at the Nature Conservancy to try to understand how they've grown and evolved. And what's powerful about their model is that it's the mothership that really manages the shared resources and helps set the strategy and provides technical assistance to the chapters. But it's a lot of the activity and value happens in those local chapters. So it's those folks who understand, which parcels of land are at risk. They understand which parts of the community are invested in which projects. And so the fundraising and preservation, a lot of that effort happens locally. And so what we are trying to do as we build out our investment and acquisition and portfolio is to set up those state level structures, drawing on that analogy of the Nature Conservancy, so that we have strong and ongoing local partnerships. Because ultimately, we want the ownership and the governance to really be at the local level. We want to be the catalysts, and we want to be the disseminators of good ideas and resources. But it's really local ownership that's going to make a difference, we think, for long-term sustainability. But maybe Sam has some ideas, because I know, Sam, you've done a bunch of work in housing, and
Yep.
there are some similar models there too.
I was going to say that when I first heard about the National Trust and what it was doing in Colorado, my first thought was, and my background is very much in affordable housing and community economic development, but my first thought was like, oh, this is just like the joint ownership entity in New York City, or Joe NYC, which is a nonprofit organization that was set up to be an asset manager on behalf of about a dozen nonprofit owners and operators of affordable housing, who kind of pool their assets together for some kind of like professionalization and joint asset management at the entity level. And there's all kinds of models like community land trusts and other kind of cooperative models. Rock USA, for instance, is doing facilitating the acquisition of manufactured home communities, what is colloquially called trailer parks, but is manufactured housing, to acquire them and own them and operate them as cooperatives instead of them selling off to private equity funds. So there's a lot of interesting parallels to the housing and economic development area. Can I add one thing to what you were saying, Elizabeth, about scale and local partnerships and kind of replicating this model elsewhere? And that is that, through this networked set of relationships that you had in Colorado, you had 3 foundations willing to stand up to provide these guarantees, who were committed to what you guys were doing, had a history of collaborating together, and had some sophistication around using their balance sheet in that way. And I just want to put out a kind of call to action to say that, finding those philanthropic partners in other places could really be accelerated by having a partner willing to come in and be sort of a first mover on providing a guarantee, either a corporate guarantee or a corporate philanthropic guarantee. If there are any large companies that are committed to local news, Chris, if you know of any, like Google, that could stand behind something like this and help it replicate in other places, I think that could be a really exciting role for a company like Google.
It's a good call out, Sam. We do not shy away from it. So I appreciate you surfacing it. I'll put a pin in something. I'll mention something at the very end along those lines for everybody to be aware of. And
Chris, let me just follow up on that for a minute, because I think there's been some questions about what the trust's longer term strategy is.
Sure.
And it is precisely that. Like FJC is, a fantastic bridge partner to make sure that we're responsive to the preservation efforts that are right in front of us. But our goal at the trust is to build a bigger fund that can help us do this at scale. And I think Tim had a question earlier about whether there are any entities operating at the Alden type, 600 million. And so, part of what we're doing in this early stage of our development is showing how this can work in a couple of states and in a couple of flavors, so that we have those proof points to be able to go out to impact investors of all kinds, and major foundations and corporations that want to use their balance sheet in this way, and say, let's build a fund that would really scale this structural reorientation of the field. So that's where we're headed. It's both like proving the concepts state by state, and then also, laying the foundation for this bigger fund. Because ultimately, if we did this project by project, as we've done, we would not meet the need. We think there's like 4,000 independent titles left in something like 1,300 counties around the country, and like the clock is ticking.
And Elizabeth, in terms of dollars, that's like you're dimensioning it at about 300 million.
Yeah, 300 million, which is small compared to other investments in other problem areas. I mean, we're looking at a paper in a small rural state whose owner wants $60,000 for it. So there's, and if this paper goes away, it would be a news desert. So that's that. There are many, many, many projects and important preservation opportunities like that, and it's small dollars compared to what we're seeing at the metro level in terms of price tags.
So this is, Elizabeth, you started to talk about kind of what your future goals are. There's a question that surfaced in the chat, and just kind of one follow-up prompt here for you. What are your considerations about the diversity of the communities which the publications serve? Where does that play into your kind of investigation and outreach for potential partners or acquisitions?
Yeah, it's a really critical part of our strategy and what we're trying to solve for. We've been in conversations with the local media association that has their consortium of Black publishers, Word in Black, and they shared with us like a shocking statistic, something like 2,000 Black publishers were in operation 5 years ago, and there's something like 200 today. And many of these are succession issues where they're small businesses with small business owners who don't necessarily have a succession plan, can't necessarily find someone to buy out the business. And that's one data point, but there are community publishers that serve ethnic communities, that serve linguistic communities all over the country that often fly under the radar of some of our bigger discussions on the sort of future of local news. And there's really, there's critical succession issues there. And so part of what we're trying to do is figure out who's operating those spaces. How can we partner together to figure out what succession, preservation, transformation looks like. And then, as owners in sort of geographically based news, like what's the diversity of those communities? How have they been served? How can we put in new publishers and new strategies to really honor and acknowledge that, communities across the country do not look like what they looked like when some of these organizations were founded. And that's the real opportunity, not just at the preservation side of our mission, but of the transformation side.
And Sam, to pull you in here due to a question that surfaced in the chat, when for your donors, what are you seeing in terms of what their desires are? Are there instructions from your donors to dedicate these dollars towards efforts for diversity, for inclusion?
It's really all over the map, Chris. It's very hard to generalize. Like on a week-by-week basis, we get hundreds of grant recommendations coming in. It's very hard to generalize.
Fair enough. But thanks for the question from the chat. We're coming up on time here, and audience members, we've tried to do kind of an organic way of watching the chat and answering your questions. So apologies if we did not get to all of them specifically. But as we begin to close things out, I'd like to invite each of the three of you to call out one thing that you hope everybody watching today leaves with from our conversation. Maybe Lillian, we'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think that what I would love for everyone to leave with is just a greater sense and excitement about breaking orthodoxy, about how we think about support, how we think about investment in different organizations. And hopefully this starts to open up some really interesting and distinct opportunities and research points. And, I hope you all walk away with that and know that the National Trust is always ready to be a thought partner on whatever you've got cooking.
Thanks, Lillian. Sam, how about you? A closing thought for our audience?
I think just that, the challenge that the private equity model threw down the gauntlet was looking at both the sort of governance and ownership values and the constraints that their financing providers put on them. And, philanthropy and the nonprofit sector, mission folks working together can figure out sort of workarounds on both the governance and the financing side to make something that works for the public interest.
Thanks, Sam. And Elizabeth, I'll ask you to answer a tactical question and then give us kind of a closing thought. There is some question surfacing in the chat about radio. If you could just speak for a moment, does radio figure into your plans? And then give us that one thing you'd like everybody to leave with.
Yeah, so I'll combine them into one. You know, part of what we are doing on a state-by-state basis is composing new ownership groups, and we really see public media as a critically important stakeholder. As all of you out there know, public media has sort of bucked the trend of other media and grown as other media ecosystems have shrunk. And in many, many places, it's the public media station now that has the biggest revenue. In many places, they have the biggest newsroom. And so we really want to be composing these structures in a way that takes advantage of this kind of anchor newsroom that so many public stations are building towards. And, you know, we're starting to talk with stations in communities around the country about their interest and appetite for partnering with us, for understanding the community news needs and landscape in their areas. And so if you're a station that wants to have that conversation, please do reach out to us, because we want to figure out what this, you know, what a flavor of local ownership structures look like with public media in the mix, because it is so critical and such an important piece of our information landscape.
Well, that I thought reach out is a key message I heard in that. So with that, let me provide my thanks to Elizabeth, Lillian, and Sam for a really productive session today. Always fascinating to dig into new models for news sustainability, and we're humbled and glad to play some part in that. For our audience, thank you for joining us. In related news, I'd like to briefly plug, this is something I referenced earlier, teased earlier, briefly plug our latest North American Innovation Challenge. So we're welcoming applications for projects which focus on a fundamental challenge for local publishers, which is exactly as we've discussed today, understanding and serving the needs of your communities. Projects will be evaluated, and if they are selected, they may receive up to $200,000 in funding for that project. The application window is open through August 26th, so a little bit over a month away. So please use your favorite search engine to search up the Google News Initiative Innovation Challenge. Again, Google News Initiative Innovation Challenge, and you will find your way to more information and the application form. So with that, thanks again, Elizabeth, Lillian, and Sam. And we're going to turn it back over to Andrew.
Hi, everyone. Andrew here from Greater Public. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, panel. Just a couple of closing housekeeping reminders. This session will be recorded and posted probably later today. And you can rate the session just below your video window. There's a little gray text that says rate now. Please provide some feedback to our panel. I know they'd appreciate it. Don't forget about our sponsors and our contest. So you can gather points throughout the conference by finding clues in the sessions, and the winner gets a registration to next year's conference in Chicago. And other than that, enjoy the rest of your conference day, and thank you again to our panelists and to Google News Initiative. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.